Good morning. Welcome to Trinity Episcopal Parish's discussion and class over the history of Christian worship. Last week we started a brand new section, which is over daily prayer. Our introduction last week covered some broad contours of what you can expect in the early church's observance of daily prayer, such as the cathedral model, such as the monastic model, and a couple of hymns that develop around the time, and what it means for us to be observing the daily hours. Implicit in this observance is something we touched on just a little bit last time, which actually turns out to be a hugely important part of the cycle of daily prayer that the earliest Christians developed. And it is simply referred to as the regula. The regula is another word that we use to describe a centrally important aspect of daily prayer, and that is regular. Regula is also a word that we take the word rule from. And this idea of regular, or the rule of prayer, the regular rotation of prayer, speaks to something that was centrally important for the early Christians, which is to have a plan and routine for how you observe your prayer. This is nothing that is particularly out of the ordinary when it comes to prayer practice, but the simple fact is the earliest Christians, all the way to modern day Christians, recognize if you don't have a plan and regular rule for your prayer life, it's not just going to happen by itself. It's something that takes intentionality. It's something that requires your attentiveness. It requires your effort in order to keep this practice alive. And in fact, the idea of regula, the idea of rule, routine, regular prayer, is as old as the development of Christianity itself. In fact, in our Jewish heritage in the Old Testament, the regular hours of prayer is actually something that is hinted at several times within the Psalms themselves. In fact, there is indeed a psalm that refers to 7 times a day do I praise you. And not that this is any random number. The Old Testament very rarely uses numbers so cavalierly, but that the number that is referred to in this case is something much more indicative of a regular practice. Not just 7 times a day on a whim do I praise you, but 7 times a day do I planned praise you. When we talk about the regula, there is undoubtedly a couple of people that we have to talk about within the early church. Both were incredibly important as it came to the development of the early church and the development of a robust practice, but both are important for different reasons. And this time we are going to talk about the importance of regula, of routine, for 2 of our very major saints in the Christian church. Because today we're going to be talking about the rule of St. Augustine of Hippo, and the rule of St. Benedict of Nursia. Both of these Christians are monumentally important in the development of a regular practice of prayer within their contexts of the church. St. Augustine lives at an earlier point in time than St. Benedict does, but nonetheless, they also have their own unique ways of adding, building upon, and regulating how exactly life should be. And even before we talk about prayer, the regula, the rule, is so much wider than just the rules for how we do prayer, if that makes sense. The regula for the early Christians really was a way of life. It was not simply a rule for how you're supposed to do prayer. It was a rule for all aspects of your life. And specifically in the rule of St. Augustine and in the rule of St. Benedict, it was a rule for monastic life. How are monks supposed to live together? How are those who are vowed monastics, whether they be female or male, how do those vowed monastics live together? What is the rule of their lives? Some of you might be familiar with something called a rule of life, and this is exactly the kind of thing where it comes from. The monastic discipline of the rule that sets the rhythm and times of your life. This is important because for St. Augustine and St. Benedict, one of the things they want to make explicitly clear is that prayer is not a separate part of life. Prayer is not meant to be separated from the rest of your regular life. In fact, prayer is supposed to be an integral part of your life. It's not just an activity amongst other activities. If we believe that prayer unto God is actually something that the world needs, that we need, and that God desires for us, this is not an option for us Christians. This is something that we need to plan carefully and think carefully about when it comes to our daily observance of how we foster our relationship with God. Again, as we talked about last time, relationships don't just maintain themselves. It takes effort, and it takes the commitment of a particular mode, a particular orientation of one's self every single hour of the day. Starting with St. Augustine, the rule of St. Augustine is, at least as it comes to our scholarship, is perhaps the oldest rule that we have in its completeness for the way that vowed monastics should live. It is, at least what we can tell, the oldest rule of monastic life that we have, dated to the late 300s. St. Augustine speaks very specifically about what the rules are for the monastery. The monastery, or the place in which the vowed monastics are meant to be rooming together, so to speak. The monastery, the place where the brothers or sisters would then gather for prayer, is referred to in St. Augustine's rule as the oratory. Now, the oratory is actually based off of a Latin parlance, the ora, O-R-A, which actually means pray. It means prayer. In fact, even in modern day Spanish, the word oremos means let us pray. So you have that same little link there. The O-R-E-M-U-S, oremus, is linked to the Latin ora, O-R-A, and that just means prayer. So where I am sitting right now at the prayer desk, in the Augustinian rule is, it's the place in the particular church, the particular monastery in which people go to pray. And it's important because St. Augustine makes very explicit mention that there are set prayer hours. The oratory is meant only for prayer. It is meant only for when you gather and say your prayers. And there are set hours at the times where the monastics meet to say their prayers. Hours during the day that punctuate the places in our regular day life, regula, that sanctify the time, as one theologian would say. Allowing God to break into the life that we live in a particular manner, and remembering that, we as humans, remembering that specifically at various hours throughout the day. Now, St. Augustine doesn't restrict the oratory just to the those particular hours in which you are supposed to gather, but St. Augustine actually even says that if someone desires to come in and pray, that no one should stop them. that if they desire to pray outside of what is the normal times, the regular times, the regula, that they are absolutely permitted to do. They should not be stopped for any reason whatsoever to say their prayers in the oratory. The set rule of life that St. Augustine prescribes for the prayer assumes that prayer is going to be mingled with what the rest of the daily life and work of the monks are going to be. But again, the prayer in the oratory is not separate from the rest of what the monks are doing. It is integral to the way that the brotherhood or sisterhood of that particular Christian community functions. It is shot through with prayer because in prayer and in life, these two things are meant to be together, not meant to be separate ideas just floating around and sometimes bumping into each other. This is sometimes, at least from my own experience, this is what sometimes happens with those who are trying to develop a prayer life that have never developed one before. It feels like you're imposing a spiritual exercise in a regular pattern of life. But the thing that we need to remember is that it's not imposing something exterior to ourselves in adding a prayer practice. It actually is fulfilling a holistic life. And if you've gone your whole life without having a regular way of integrating something as vital as prayer into your life, it really does feel strange to stop what you're doing and to sit and pray to God. And it feels strange because, of course, in our U.S. context, it feels like we're not doing anything. But again, that is a very modern mindset, a very contemporary mindset that tries to bifurcate life from spirit, that tries to bifurcate the stuff that we do versus the religious activities that we add in there. Where for us as Christians, those two things are inseparable from each other, and they should not be separated. And the fact that they are separated says far more about our contemporary culture than it says about the way we should live. And St. Augustine's rule, the earliest rule in the Christian church, and again, this is in the late 300s. There have been monastic practice for 200 years at this point. And the thing is that this is not something that comes out of nowhere. This is something that comes out of a deep integration and a deep study into the first communities in the Acts of the Apostles, where it says that all of the communities shared everything in common, that they devoted themselves to what? They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, the breaking of bread, and the prayers. In other words, they devoted themselves as a body, as one people, to these things in a regular basis. So this is nothing new. This is something very ancient that for us in modern day, especially in the Western side of Christianity, or at least the Western industrial side of Christianity, might seem strange at first, but actually is far more true than perhaps our current contemporary context might suggest. And the rule of St. Augustine makes this very clear. But we can't talk about monasticism and prayer practice without talking about perhaps the most important monastic that has to do with prayer, or at least the most important person who wrote a rule of prayer. And that is none other than St. Benedict of Nursia. St. Benedict is a vowed monastic who is developing a particular rule for laity, not ordained clergy, to be a part of a vowed monastic community that understands itself as a community under rule, under regula. And the rule of St. Benedict is far more expansive than the rule of St. Augustine. It's far longer. And the reason why is because, perhaps at least personality-wise, whereas St. Augustine outlines the theological contours of what the community should do, and of course some practical aspects, St. Benedict is intensely practical. He has rules for everything. He has regulation for everything. A regula that runs the monastic's life for almost anything you can imagine in his contemporary time period. And the reason why this is important is because St. Benedict makes explicit what the church will pick up as a regula of prayer practice from this time forth, basically until contemporary times, even for us Episcopalians who use the Book of Common Prayer, which is intensely based upon St. Benedict's rule and Benedictine life, especially as it comes to common prayer. That's actually where we kind of hail back to a Benedictine root. It is common prayer. It's not just our prayer, it's common prayer. But St. Benedict outlines specific hours explicitly in the rule that are to be observed. And they can be broken into what we would refer to as nighttime hours and daytime hours. St. Benedict even insists that your sleep, your nighttime resting, is also a point in which God is still present. And so for St. Benedict, the explicit times in which St. Benedict is going to command that these prayers be observed is on a fairly intensive basis, but it also is based upon the psalm verse that we talked about earlier, that 7 times a day do I praise you. This is what develops into what we refer to as the divine hours. The hours of the day in which we go to the oratory and say our prayers. And these hours roughly are going to be the following. You have, starting at the daylight hours, you have lauds, which is simply the morning prayers, the times where you say prayers in the morning, followed by what is referred to as the 3 small hours, or the 3 minor hours, which are 9 a.m. in the morning, 12 noon, and 3 p.m. in our modern day, referred to as the 3rd, 6th, and 9th hours. Now that doesn't mean 3 o'clock, 6 o'clock, 9 o'clock, it means the 3rd, 6th, and 9th hour of daylight, which roughly translates to 9 a.m., 12 p.m., and 3 p.m. But you also have the nighttime rotation, when the sun goes down. You have Vespers, evening prayer, which is to be said right as the sun is setting. You have Compline, which is the prayers said right before you retire to bed for the evening. But then you also have the great nighttime, or the nocturne, which is the great observance of something called matins. Matins is a very rich, large prayer office that is a nighttime observance, that is rich with psalms and all of these various things. But for St. Benedict, these rotations are set in concrete, if that makes sense. This is the foundation for which the monastics who are vowed under St. Benedict's rule then live their lives. A beloved professor once gave this description of the way that you can think about prayer practice, especially within the more traditional Christian church, which is that you have a jar that's, a mason jar that big, and you fill it with big, big rocks, and then you pour sand in it, and then you pour water in it. And one of the things that we talk about is, if you look at this as being an example of the important things in your life, the big rocks that are in this little mason jar are what we would refer to as bedrock practices. These are things that are so important, they have to go in the jar first. Because guess what? That sand and that water fill in all around these big, big rocks, right? They fill in all around these things, and they make it so that you can't put any big rocks in anymore. They fill in the parts that are lacking amongst these rounded rocks. The point of this is that for St. Benedict, those big rocks in that mason jar are the hours. They are the hours in which you are observing your prayer practice, and the rest of one's life then fills in where those rocks take up space, which is one of the Benedictine ideas of ora et labora. Again, ora, prayer, and labora, prayer and work. That's what labora means. In other words, prayer as a dotting of the time, a punctuating of the day with the divine presence, our reminding ourselves of the divine presence, but also the work in which we do during the day is also part and parcel of that prayer. It's prayer and work. It's a conjunctive type of thing. Prayer and work, the foundation stones for Benedictine spirituality. And these two things are not separate from each other. It's not, I do my work and sometimes I sprinkle in this religious observance. But nor is it, do I only say my religious observance and pray because that's the only important thing that I do, and work can come when it does. It is a balance, or you might say it is a regulation of our lives, a regula, a rule, in which we are holding together both the prayer to God, sanctifying and continuing our life with Jesus, and our work that is supposed to be shot through with prayer as we go along. The mental prayer, the constant reminder that, maybe as Brother Lawrence, another very important monastic, would say, that we serve the God of all pots and pans. Brother Lawrence was worked in the kitchen at his monastery and noted the point of finding God in the utterly ordinary, not the extraordinary, but recognizing that God is in the utterly ordinary of life, and that there's no place where the presence of God does not pierce into, even doing the dishes. But that is why St. Augustine and St. Benedict are so focused on a rule of daily set prayer. Because the point of all of that is not so that you can be a particularly pious person. It's not so that you can be a particularly astute prayer practitioner. The point is that all of us, regardless of who we are being taught by the regulation of our life that God is in it all, that God is present in all of the activities of life, and not just a bifurcated idea. Again, this is something that is strange to our contemporary culture, that is so easy in dividing what we refer to as sacred and secular. This is a sacred thing. In other words, this is a religious activity, and this is a secular activity. This doesn't have to do with religion. That's not how we as Christians conceive the world. There is no such thing as sacred and secular to the Christian. They are all one thing. There are holy things and unholy things within this realm of both of this sacred secular combination. Of course, there are certain things that are holy and certain things that are not. But the thing is that we cannot so easily separate those things. And in order to get back to a connection, it's important to recognize that the earliest Christian practice of daily prayer fundamentally was not just about rules of how to say prayer. It was a rule that encompassed your entire lived life. And specifically for our monastic brothers and sisters, such as under the rule of St. Augustine or under the rule of St. Benedict, this rule, this regula, was the determining factor for how their regular rotation of life interacted, and not just your regular rotation of a religious observance within that wider context. Because the religious observance, the prayer to God, is not able to be dropped. It is an integral part of our life. So when we think about the early church and we think about the regula, we need to get into our minds in the 300s through 500s when St. Augustine and St. Benedict are doing their work. This development of the regula, of the regular rotation of prayer, is going to fundamentally influence the rest of Christian history as it comes to how we approach daily prayer. This is especially the case once we get to the later early church period into the medieval time period, in which the way in which regular Christian observance of prayer forms around these divine hours that are inseparable from regular everyday life. An interesting example of this, and we'll end with this particular example. If you go to Europe, specifically if you check out Germany, there is an interesting thing that happens when it comes to city layout. When you go to some of these older villages, some of the older places within the wider landscape of Europe. And it is that when you walk into the main portions of their downtown market or the main portions of their cityscapes, you will undeniably notice something interesting. All of the roads that you travel lead to a central courtyard that has one building in the middle of it, and it is a church. This is especially the case whenever you go to Cambridge in England. When you walk down the streets of England, the interesting thing about this is that the street sides that you walk down invariably lead to an open space that has a church at it. And one of the reasons why this was so important is because during the wide practice of the existence of the church in Europe, it was not only expected, it was taken as if just for granted that people were going to stop by to say their prayers on their way to work. The streets led to where the church was so that people could have a very clear way of being able to centrally locate themselves to where they're going to say their prayers, and then they would go and do their work. Undeniably, you will probably be able to see how some of this early church monastic model, this regula, was also a lot bigger than the monastery. It was culturally a part of the way that Europe even set up their city planning. And you can go to various places within Germany, within France, within England, and you can see this same architectural city planning choice of having the churches being at the ends of the main street passages. That, in a sense, illustrates what St. Benedict and St. Augustine are getting at. The integration of one's entire life into the practice of both your sanctifying of the time through your prayer to God and your work in the service of God are two parts of the same thing that cannot be separated from each other. And that this practice of daily prayer was so important for the early Christians that these regulas became so much more than just a way you say your prayers, but a way that you live your life. Thank you so much for joining into this session of our History of Christian Worship. Next week, we'll be getting into the medieval time period and the particular changes and adjustments that we can see while also retaining the main focus of the regula of daily prayer, and we will be able to see what the focus changes as we get into the higher Middle Ages. Until then, friends, be safe, and may God bless you.